In 1949, when 12 nations signed the treaty creating NATO, the architects of the alliance had one secret blueprint no one talked about publicly. It wasn't a military strategy document. It wasn't a tactical manual. It was a list of mistakes, failures, and near-catastrophic conflicts between allies during World War II. Several Allied generals privately believed that if another war started without fixing these mistakes, millions would die before politicians even agreed who was in charge. The men who designed NATO had watched the British-American alliance nearly tear itself apart multiple times between 1942 and 1945. They'd seen how national pride, competing egos, and unclear command structures had cost lives and nearly lost battles. And they were determined never to let it happen again. The question wasn't whether allies would disagree. The question was, how do you build a military alliance that can survive those disagreements? The answer came from studying every moment when British and American commanders had clashed, competed, and almost destroyed their own partnership. This is the story of how World War II's greatest failures became NATO's greatest lessons. When World War II ended in 1945, two things were immediately clear to Western leaders. First, the Soviet Union was not going to be a partner in peace. Stalin's armies occupied Eastern Europe, and the Iron Curtain was descending. Second, if the West was going to deter Soviet aggression, it would need a military alliance. But not just any alliance, one that could actually function under pressure. The problem was that the last major alliance, the British-American partnership in World War II, had functioned on the edge of collapse. General Dwight Eisenhower had spent as much time mediating between British and American commanders as he had fighting Germans. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and General George Patton had despised each other. Strategic disagreements had delayed operations, wasted resources, and created dangerous gaps in Allied lines. The alliance had won, but it had won despite its internal conflicts, not because of smooth cooperation. Now, in 1949, the stakes were even higher. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. Western Europe was devastated and vulnerable. There would be no time to sort out command disputes or national rivalries if war came. So the architects of NATO, many of them veterans of World War II command structures, sat down to answer a question. What had gone wrong between 1942 and 1945, and how could they prevent it from happening again? Their analysis would reshape how military alliances operated for the next 75 years. And the first lesson came from a disaster that nearly destroyed the alliance before it even began: North Africa. In November 1942, American forces landed in North Africa as part of Operation Torch. The command structure was a mess from the start. American General Dwight Eisenhower was nominally in charge, but British commanders in the region, who'd been fighting there for 2 years, believed they should control strategy. American generals thought British caution was cowardice. British officers thought American confidence was ignorance. No one had clear authority. Decisions required negotiation between London and Washington. Orders were delayed, contradicted, or ignored. The result was Kasserine Pass, the first major battle between American and German forces in World War II. American troops were badly beaten, over 6,000 casualties, entire units routed. German forces under Rommel inflicted a humiliating defeat that could have been far worse if British forces hadn't stabilized the line. After Kasserine Pass, American and British leaders realized something fundamental: you cannot fight a war by committee. Eisenhower was given real authority, not just a title, but actual command over all Allied forces in North Africa. British and American units would operate under a single chain of command, not competing national hierarchies. It wasn't perfect. Montgomery still acted like an independent operator. Patton still chafed at any British oversight. But the principle was established. Unified command wasn't optional. It was essential for survival. And this failure would directly shape NATO's most controversial rule. When NATO was created in 1949, this lesson was written into its founding structure. There would be a supreme Allied commander, an American general who would have authority over all NATO forces in wartime. Not advisory authority, command authority. British, French, Canadian, and other national forces would operate under this unified command structure from the first day of any conflict. But unified command solved only one problem. The second lesson came from a different kind of disaster, the race for glory. In July 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily. On paper, it was a joint British-American operation. In reality, it became a competition to see who could reach Messina first. Montgomery commanded British forces on the eastern coast. Patton led American forces in the west. Both men saw Sicily not as a military objective, but as a test of national prestige. Montgomery wanted to prove British strategy was superior. Patton wanted to show that American aggression could outperform British caution. The result was chaos. Resources were wasted, coordination broke down. Both armies raced forward with exposed flanks and overstretched supply lines. They were lucky. If German forces had been stronger, either army could have been cut off and destroyed. Patton reached Messina first. He stood in the city square, waiting with photographers to greet Montgomery when the British general arrived hours later. It was a public relations victory, but it was a strategic failure. Because the real objective, trapping and destroying German forces before they could escape to mainland Italy, had been lost. While British and American forces competed for glory, tens of thousands of German soldiers evacuated across the Strait of Messina. They would fight again. Many of them would kill Allied soldiers in the brutal Italian campaign that followed. After the war, this became a case study in what not to do. NATO's founders understood that alliance warfare required something psychologically difficult, subordinating national glory to collective success. When NATO's structure was designed, mission objectives were defined clearly and collectively. Success would be measured by whether NATO achieved its goals, not by which nation's forces got credit. This seems obvious now, but in 1949 it was revolutionary. For centuries, military alliances had been coalitions where each nation pursued its own interests. NATO would be different, a structure where national forces worked toward shared objectives, even if it meant accepting less individual recognition. But even with unified command and shared objectives, one final problem remained. What happens when allies fundamentally disagree about strategy? The British and Americans disagreed about almost every major strategic decision in World War II. Should they invade France in 1943 or wait until 1944? Concentrate forces for a single thrust into Germany or advance on a broad front? Prioritize the liberation of Paris or the destruction of German armies? These weren't minor tactical questions. They were fundamental disagreements about how to win the war. And the way the alliance handled them was dangerously informal. Churchill and Roosevelt would negotiate. Eisenhower would mediate. Montgomery and other British commanders would lobby through their government. American generals would push back through theirs. Sometimes this produced good decisions. Sometimes it produced disasters like Operation Martin Garden, Montgomery's ambitious plan to end the war by Christmas 1944. Martin Garden became the moment Allied trust nearly collapsed. British paratroopers were slaughtered at Arnhem. The operation cost thousands of lives and achieved nothing. Many American commanders had openly opposed Martin Garden, but there was no formal process for debating the strategic merits before resources were committed. Montgomery's influence with Churchill got the operation approved despite American skepticism. After the war, military planners recognized this as a structural failure. This argument didn't end in 1944. It was written into NATO's DNA. NATO solved it by creating something that hadn't existed before: institutionalized strategic debate. NATO's military committee, composed of the chiefs of defense from member nations, would meet regularly to discuss strategy, force deployments, and operational planning. Disagreements would be aired formally, with military professionals debating the merits before political leaders made decisions. Once a decision was made, all member nations would commit to it fully. No more Montgomery going around the command structure to lobby Churchill. No more competing national strategies within a single theater. Debate before decision, unity after decision. This structure is why NATO has survived for 75 years while other alliances have fallen apart. It acknowledges that democracies will disagree, but it channels that disagreement into productive debate rather than destructive rivalry. Yet even with these structures in place, one final lesson remained, perhaps the most important of all. In December 1944, Germany launched its surprise offensive through the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. The attack revealed every weakness in Allied cooperation. American forces were caught unprepared. Communication broke down. Units were surrounded. The front seemed ready to collapse. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting of Allied commanders. The tension in the room was extreme. Months of accumulated rivalries and resentments surfaced. Montgomery suggested that British forces take command of American units north of the German breakthrough. American generals exploded. Bradley threatened to resign. Patton called it an insult. But Eisenhower made a decision that transcended the personal conflicts. He gave Montgomery temporary command not because the British were superior, but because the communication lines to those trapped units ran through British-held territory. Then he turned to Patton and asked how quickly Patton could turn his entire army northward and attack into the German flank. Patton said 2 days. Everyone thought it was impossible. 3 days later, Patton attacked. Within 2 weeks, the Bulge was eliminated. What made this moment significant wasn't the strategy, it was the human element. Eisenhower had to manage egos, soothe wounded pride, and make commanders put the mission above their personal grievances. He had to trust that Patton, despite his grandstanding, would deliver. He had to convince Bradley, despite his anger, to accept British command of American forces. This is the moment NATO's designers were most afraid of repeating. The lesson was clear. Alliance warfare requires extraordinary leadership that can navigate not just strategy, but human psychology. When NATO was designed, this lesson shaped how supreme commanders would be chosen. They wouldn't just be brilliant strategists, they would need to be diplomats, mediators, and managers of complex personalities from different military cultures. Every NATO Supreme Commander since 1949 has spent as much time managing alliance politics as planning military operations. It's not a bug in the system. It's a feature, born from the recognition that the human factor can make or break an alliance. These 4 lessons, unified command, shared objectives, institutionalized debate, and leadership that manages personalities, became NATO's foundation. But did they actually work? For 40 years, NATO never fought a war. That might seem like a failure of its military purpose, but it was actually its greatest success. NATO deterred Soviet aggression precisely because it solved the problems that had plagued the World War II alliance. The Soviets looked at NATO and saw an alliance that could actually function as a unified military force, not a collection of squabbling nations. When NATO finally did conduct major military operations in the Balkans in the 1990s, in Afghanistan after 2001, the structures designed in 1949 held. Were there disagreements? Absolutely. National interests still conflicted. Military cultures still clashed. But NATO had mechanisms to manage those disagreements that the World War II alliance never had. Strategic debates happened in committee rooms, not on battlefields. Command authority was clear from the start. No general could go around the structure to pursue personal or national glory. The alliance that had learned from British-American conflicts proved it could survive internal tensions without tearing itself apart. Not because the tensions disappeared, but because the lessons of 1942 to 1945 had been institutionalized into a structure stronger than any individual rivalry. When the 12 founding nations signed the NATO Treaty in 1949, they weren't creating something entirely new. They were building on the painful lessons of an alliance that had nearly destroyed itself while winning the greatest war in history. Every article of the NATO treaty, every element of its command structure, every protocol for strategic debate, all of it was written in response to specific failures of British-American cooperation during World War II. Kasserine Pass taught the need for unified command. Sicily taught the danger of competing for national glory. Market Garden revealed the cost of informal strategic debates. The Battle of the Bulge proved that managing personalities was as important as planning operations. These weren't abstract lessons. They were written in the blood of soldiers who died because their commanders couldn't cooperate effectively. The men who designed NATO understood something profound. Successful alliances aren't built on shared values or common threats alone. They're built on structures that can survive the inevitable disagreements, rivalries, and conflicts that arise when sovereign nations try to fight together. Every time NATO debates Ukraine, troop deployments, or defense spending today, these World War II lessons quietly resurface in how those debates are structured and resolved. NATO's 75-year survival isn't proof that democracies naturally cooperate. It's proof that with the right structures, born from honest analysis of past failures, even fractious allies can build something lasting. The British-American alliance won World War II despite its internal conflicts. NATO was designed to win wars because it learned from those conflicts. That difference between success despite dysfunction and success through institutional learning might be the most important military lesson of the 20th century. If you want to understand modern military alliances, you have to understand the mistakes that created them. Next time, we'll examine how NATO's command structure was tested during its first real crisis, the Korean War, and the debate about whether NATO forces should deploy outside Europe.